question I've heard 100 different ways over the years. He said, Ted, you've seen so many great baseball players. Who are the 5 greatest you've ever witnessed? I smiled because that's a much harder question than people think. If you ask me who hit the longest home run, I might have an answer. If you ask me who had the quickest bat, I can probably tell you. But asking me to name the 5 greatest players I've ever seen, that's different. I've spent most of my life around this game. I played against Hall of Famers. I watched young ball players turn into legends. I saw men do things on a baseball field that made you stop for a second and wonder how anybody could possibly be that good. People love talking about numbers. They'll tell you how many home runs somebody hit. They'll tell you how many batting titles he won or how many championships he has. That's part of baseball, and it always will be. But the older I got, the more I realized numbers don't tell you everything. Sometimes greatness is the feeling you get when a certain player walks up to the plate and everybody in the stadium starts paying attention. Sometimes it's watching a man play every single day and realizing he almost never makes a mistake. And sometimes it's simply knowing you're sharing the field with someone you'll probably never see the likes of again. I was fortunate enough to witness a lot of players like that. Some of them were rivals, some were friends, a few of them were both. This list isn't about who had the most records. It isn't about who historians rank first or second. It's about the players who left the biggest impression on me after all these years. I gave it a lot of thought, and the first name that came into my mind was Stan Musial. And the first name that came into my mind was Stan Musial. That probably won't surprise anybody who watched baseball during my time. If you played in the American League, you didn't get to face Stan every week, but you didn't have to. You only had to watch him a few times to understand what kind of player he was. People usually started by talking about his swing. I understand why. It was smooth. It looked effortless. He never seemed like he was trying to hit the ball as hard as he could. Somehow the ball just kept finding the barrel of his bat. Day after day, year after year, he kept doing the same thing. That's a rare quality. There are players who have one incredible season. There are players who catch lightning in a bottle for a few years. Then there are players like Stan Musial. You looked up one summer and he was hitting over 330. The next summer he was doing it again. A few years later, nothing had changed. It almost became normal, which is funny because there was nothing normal about it. One thing people don't always appreciate is consistency. Anybody can have a great afternoon. The truly great players make you expect greatness every single day. That's what Stan did. I remember talking with other ball players over the years, and nobody ever seemed to have a bad word to say about him. That's unusual. Baseball clubhouses are full of opinions. Players disagree about almost everything. But when Stan Musial's name came up, the conversation usually sounded the same. He's one of the best. Not because somebody told us to say it, because we'd all seen it ourselves. He wasn't trying to be the loudest player on the field. He wasn't looking for attention. He just went about his business, and before you knew it, he'd beaten you again. I always respected players like that. They let their game do the talking. Looking back now, I think that's one reason Stan stayed in people's minds for so long. He didn't need to convince anyone he was great. He showed you one swing at a time. That's why when I started putting this list together, Stan Musial was one of the very first names I thought of. Another player I have to talk about is Willie Mays. Now, Willie was different. There have been a lot of players who could hit. There have been a lot who could run. Plenty of players could throw, and plenty could make great catches. Willie seemed like he could do all of it. That's what always impressed me. People remember the catch, and they should. It was one of the greatest plays baseball has ever seen. But if you only remember that one play, you missed what made Willie Mays so special. He played like that all the time. You'd watch him for 9 innings, and sooner or later he'd do something that made everybody shake their heads. Maybe he'd run down a ball that looked impossible to catch. Maybe he'd take an extra base that nobody else would even tried for. Maybe he'd hit a ball halfway into the seats. It never seemed to matter what the game needed. Willie had a way of giving it to you. One thing I always admired was how complete he was. People spent a lot of time arguing about the greatest hitter or the greatest pitcher or the greatest defensive player. Willie made those conversations difficult because he belonged in all of them. He could beat you in so many different ways that sometimes I don't think people appreciated everything he was doing. That's the funny thing about complete players. When somebody does everything well, people almost start taking it for granted. I never did. I knew how hard this game was. I knew how much work it took just to stay in the big leagues, let alone become an all-star. Then you'd watch Willie Mays make another incredible play, jog back to his position, and act like it was just another afternoon. There wasn't much showing off. There wasn't much celebrating. He simply expected excellence from himself. I always respected that. Looking back now, I honestly believe there aren't many players in baseball history who could help a team as many different ways as Willie Mays could. He wasn't just winning games with his bat. He was saving runs in center field. He was taking extra bases. He was making pitchers nervous every time he reached first. That's the kind of player every manager dreams about. When I think about the greatest players I've ever witnessed, Willie Mays has to be near the very top. Not because he was the best at one thing, because he was extraordinary at almost everything. And the next person I want to talk about is Mickey Mantle. To be honest, I don't think anybody who watched Mickey every day ever forgot him. Most people start with the home runs. I understand that. He hit baseballs harder than just about anybody I'd ever seen. There were times you'd hear the sound off his bat before you even looked up. You knew it was going a long way. But that isn't what impressed me the most. What always stayed with me was how much ability one man could have. He could hit from both sides of the plate. He could run. He had tremendous power. And before all the injuries started catching up with him, he could cover a lot of ground in center field. That's a combination you don't see very often. People sometimes forget how young he was when he became the face of the Yankees. That's a heavy burden for anybody. Playing in New York isn't like playing anywhere else. If you have a bad week, everybody notices. If you have a bad month, people start wondering what's wrong with you. Mickey lived with that kind of attention almost every day of his career. Still, every season, he found a way to remind people why they believed in him. I always thought there was something almost effortless about the way he played. Not because baseball was easy for him. Nobody at that level finds this game easy. But Mickey had gifts that very few players are born with. Sometimes you'd watch him hit a ball that most players would have fouled off, and somehow it'd end up 50 rows deep in the stands. You can't teach that. One thing I've always believed is that talent will get people's attention. Character is what keeps their respect. Mickey had teammates who loved playing with him. Opponents respected him. Fans couldn't wait to watch him. That doesn't happen by accident. Looking back now, I honestly think people only got to see part of what Mickey Mantle could have been. The injuries took something away from him. Even so, he still put together a career that most players could only dream about. I've wondered more than once what his numbers would have looked like if he'd stayed healthy from beginning to end. I don't know if anybody can answer that. What I do know is this. Every time Mickey Mantle stepped onto a baseball field, you had the feeling something special might happen. Not every player gives you that feeling. The truly great ones do. That's why Mickey Mantle belongs on this list. Not just because of what he accomplished, because he had a kind of talent that comes around once in a generation. And the next player I have to mention is Joe DiMaggio. When I first started hearing people talk about Joe, he already felt larger than baseball. He wasn't just another great player. He was Joe DiMaggio. Everywhere he went, people paid attention. Fans filled the ballparks hoping they'd see him do something special. Reporters followed everything he did. Young players looked at him the way kids look at their heroes. I understood why. There was something about the way Joe carried himself that was different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to entertain people every minute. He just walked onto the field with a quiet confidence that everybody noticed. Some players play the game. Joe seemed to represent it. One thing that always stood out to me was how smooth everything looked. Whether he was hitting, running, or playing center field, nothing ever seemed rushed. The game looked slower when he was out there. Now, I know it wasn't. Baseball has never been slow at that level. But the greatest players have a way of making difficult things look ordinary. Joe did that as well as anybody I've ever seen. People still talk about the 56-game hitting streak. I don't blame them. It's one of those records that almost doesn't seem real. The longer you play this game, the more impossible it starts to sound. Anybody can get hot for a week. A few players can stay hot for a month, doing it for 56 straight games. I don't know if we'll ever see that again. But if I'm being honest, that isn't the first thing I think about when I remember Joe DiMaggio. I think about the standard he set. Every time he took the field, you expected professionalism. You expected consistency. You expected him to do something that helped his club win. There weren't many wasted moments with Joe. He respected the game too much for that. I think younger players learned just by watching him. Sometimes you don't need speeches. Sometimes the best lesson is seeing somebody prepare the right way every single day. Joe had that effect on people. The funny thing about true greatness is that it doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's steady. Sometimes it's simply a player showing up every afternoon and giving you exactly what you hope to see. That's who Joe DiMaggio was. Looking back now, I don't just remember one season or one record. I remember the example he set. I remember the respect people had for him, and I remember thinking that if you wanted to understand what it meant to be a complete professional baseball player, all you had to do was watch Joe DiMaggio for a few innings. That's why he belongs on this list. Not only because he was one of the greatest players I've ever witnessed, because he was one of the players who defined what greatness looked like. And the last player I truly believe belongs on this list is Babe Ruth. Now, some people might say that's an easy choice. Maybe it is. But sometimes the obvious answer is still the right one. The funny thing is, a lot of people know Babe Ruth from the stories. They know the home runs. They know the legends. They know the larger-than-life personality. I was fortunate enough to know that there was much more to him than that. When people talk about Babe, they usually start with the numbers. I understand why. For a long time, it seemed like he was competing against baseball itself instead of the other teams. Every season he did something people had never seen before. He changed the way hitters thought. He changed the way pitchers had to work. In a lot of ways, he changed what fans expected from the game. Before Babe Ruth, baseball looked one way. After Babe Ruth, it looked another. Very few players can honestly say that. One thing I've always believed is that greatness isn't only about being better than the players around you. Sometimes it's about changing the game for everyone who comes after you. That's exactly what Babe did. Every power hitter who came along later was measured against him. Every slugger heard his name. Every generation tried to find the next Babe Ruth. That tells you everything you need to know. I never thought of him as just another Hall of Famer. He was the standard. People ask me who the greatest hitter ever was. I've heard that question for most of my life. Naturally, my own name gets brought into the conversation from time to time. I've always appreciated that, but I never had any trouble saying how much I admired Babe Ruth. You don't lose anything by recognizing greatness. If anything, baseball becomes more meaningful when you appreciate the players who built it before you. Looking back now, I think that's something people forget. Every generation believes it has the greatest players. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. But none of those generations happen without somebody raising the bar first. Babe Ruth raised it higher than anyone. When I think about everything he meant to baseball, I don't just think about the home runs. I think about the excitement he brought to the ballpark. I think about the little kids who came just hoping to see him swing once. I think about the way one player could make an entire stadium feel alive before the first pitch was even thrown. That's rare. There have been a lot of great players. There have been Hall of Famers. There have been legends. But there are only a handful of players who changed the history of baseball forever. Babe Ruth was one of them. That's why, after thinking about all the incredible players, I was fortunate enough to witness Babe Ruth is the first name that comes to mind when someone asks me about true greatness. Looking back now, I realize how fortunate I was. I lived through an era when baseball seemed to produce another remarkable player every few years. Stan Musial showed me what consistency looked like. Willie Mays showed me what a complete ball player could be. Mickey Mantle reminded me that talent can leave even the greatest players wondering how someone does the things he does. Joe DiMaggio showed everyone what professionalism looked like. And Babe Ruth changed the game so completely that we're still talking about him all these years later. People will always argue about who belongs on a list like this. That's part of being a baseball fan. I'm sure somebody listening has a different 5. That's perfectly fine. This game has always been built on conversations like that. But these are the 5 players who left the biggest impression on me, not because